Welcome everyone to this explainer. I am so incredibly pumped to dive headfirst into the actual musical reality of 1977 with you today. We're going to sift through some really fascinating articles, deep dives, and incredibly revealing interviews from the artists who actually lived it. We're unpacking a story that goes way, way beyond the standard history books. Honestly, if you think you've got 1977 all figured out, get ready because we are about to completely shift your perspective.
Okay, let's dive right into this. When I ask you, what does 1977 sound like? What instantly pops into your head? For decades, this really specific, loud narrative has totally dominated how we remember this exact moment in time. But today, we're challenging that. We're peeling back the layers to discover what the era's true sonic landscape literally sounded like.
Here's our roadmap for the explainer. First, the myth of 1977. Second, moving beyond the safety pin. Third, the post-punk revolution. Fourth, the global avant-garde. And finally, the true legacy of 77.
Starting us off with Section 1, the myth of 1977 and the jagged safety pin. You see, in popular memory, 1977 is often reduced to exactly that, a single jagged safety pin. Think about it. The mainstream narrative treats it almost exclusively as Year Zero. The whole story goes that this was the explosive moment when three-chord punk rock just detonated in sweaty clubs in London and New York, places like CBGB. The myth is basically that punk arrived with this one singular mission, to burn down the bloated remains of the hippie era and destroy the music industry. And look, yeah, the Sex Pistols were absolutely sneering at the monarchy and setting the world on fire, for sure. But viewing 1977 solely through this punk lens, it means we totally miss out on what was actually one of the most eclectic, sophisticated years in all of musical history.
Which brings us to Section 2, Beyond the Safety Pin, a kaleidoscopic year of sound.
Zooming out to the macro level of pop culture brilliantly illustrates exactly what else was happening. I mean, look at the sheer diversity of these masterpieces. At the exact same time the punk rebellion was raging, Fleetwood Mac was turning their intense internal heartbreak into high-gloss pop perfection with Rumours. Steely Dan was pushing studio perfectionism to its absolute limits on Aja, literally abandoning the idea of a traditional band to just use a revolving door of session musicians. Then you had Earth, Wind & Fire bringing cosmic funk, and Chic practically inventing superfunk, proving the disco dance floor was actually a space for high art precision. Meanwhile, Kraftwerk was sketching the literal blueprints for the coming decade with the pristine synth pop of Trans-European Express. It was a year where every single genre seemed to hit its absolute zenith all at once.
But wait, here's what really shatters that whole punk myth. The #1 album of 1977 on the classical music ranking, it wasn't a punk record at all. It was David Bowie's Low. Coming out of a massive personal crisis, Bowie retreated to Europe and, alongside Brian Eno, built this radical masterpiece. Side A was this paranoid, fractured avant-pop, and Side B totally shifted into haunting, cinematic ambient soundscapes. He was pioneering an entirely new musical language that, honestly, defined the future way more than the flashy aggression of punk ever did.
Moving right along to Section 3, the post-punk revolution, intellectual rebellion.
Building directly off that experimental blueprint Bowie laid out, we start seeing the DNA of a brand new movement birthed right alongside punk. Now, early on, punk was all about raw, populist accessibility, right? The idea that literally anyone could pick up a guitar and just bash out 3 chords. But very quickly, a subset of artists grew completely disillusioned with that. They felt punk was already turning into a commercial formula, kind of becoming a parody of itself. So they took the DIY energy of punk but flatly rejected the tired rock cliches. They looked toward German krautrock, electronic music, and Jamaican dub. Instead of that Year Zero amateurism, they went intellectual, actively embracing avant-garde art and literature. Music critic Simon Reynolds hit the nail on the head when he theorized that post-punk wasn't really a strict genre. Instead, it was a space of possibility, defined by innovation and the willful jettisoning of rock conventions. The core belief here was simple but profound. Radical content demands radical form. They wanted to totally subvert the expected and genuinely challenge their audiences, whether that meant throwing in wildly dissonant guitars or creating these eccentric, ethereal soundscapes.
Now, what's really interesting here is how journalists were trying to make sense of it all in real time. In November 1977, writer John Savage published an editorial trying to classify this sound, and he initially called it new music. Look at the phrases he uses here. Exploring harsh urban scrapings, controlled white noise, massively accented drumming. Writers were literally coining new terms on the fly just to keep up with this rapid shift toward industrial, reggae, and dub influences.
Now, let's pan across the globe for Section 4, the global avant-garde, a case study in Brazil.
Because while all of this was exploding in the UK and the US, the exact same spirit of 1977 experimentation was happening worldwide. Let me introduce you to the Nazario brothers, Lalo and Zé Eduardo. Zé Eduardo was this drumming prodigy, playing professionally since he was 13. By the mid-70s, he was bringing serious jazz chops to Hermeto Pascual's legendary group. Meanwhile, his younger brother Lalo was completely obsessed with physics, math, and experimental electronic sounds. Together, they birthed Grupo an avant-garde jazz group that was about to push Brazilian music into completely uncharted territory.
To really grasp why they were such a game changer, we have to talk about musique concrète. It's a type of composition where, instead of using traditional musical notes, you use recorded sounds as your raw material and heavily modify them. When Lalo was just 5 years old, a family friend gave him a record featuring this European avant-garde technique, and it just blew his mind. Years later, he brought this highly abstract, experimental electronic concept directly into the Brazilian jazz scene, something totally unheard of in South America back then. Let's see how this builds into an actual track. In 1977, Grupo creates a piece called Mobile/Stabile. Walk through this amazing DIY studio process with me. First, Lalo captures these alien sci-fi sounds from massive early synthesizers like the ARP-2600 and the Moog. Second, he physically splices those incredibly short sounds using a tape editor onto 8 separate monotapes. Then he remixes them into a stereo master tape. Finally, the jazz band just improvises free jazz live over this pre-recorded electronic track. It was a spectacular, almost dangerous blend of man and machine.
But hey, pushing boundaries like that, it usually comes with a cost. In 1978, Grupo was invited to play the São Paulo Jazz Festival, which was being broadcast on national TV. When they started playing that experimental mobile/styleable track, organizers literally shut down their tape recorder and forced them off the stage mid-performance. The jury essentially deemed it degenerate art. But actually, this censorship completely backfired. It sparked massive outrage, drew tons of attention to the band, and hardened their resolve to just bypass the mainstream industry altogether.
That resilience led straight to Grupo releasing Brazil's very first independent instrumental record in 1979. This DIY ethos perfectly mirrored the indie label culture of British post-punk. Their album release show took place at this tiny, brand-new theater called Lira Paulistana. As Lalo noted, they created a space where all this creativity could be manifested. Their indie success basically kickstarted the whole Vanguarda Paulistana movement. It just goes to show that this intense desire to shatter conventions and build independent artistic ecosystems was a massive global phenomenon happening everywhere at once.
Which brings us nicely to our final section. Section 5, the legacy of 77 and shattering the rules.
So, the crucial point is this. 1977 was infinitely more complex than a single safety pin or a simple punk song. It was an era where disco, pop, and studio perfection reached their absolute zenith. It was the exact birthplace of the highly intellectual, deeply experimental post-punk movement. And as we saw with Grupo in Brazil, it was a global era defined by immense DIY electroacoustic experimentation. 1977 wasn't just about breaking the music industry, it was about totally reinventing what music could be from the ground up.
So I want to leave you with this provocative question to ponder. If 1977's spirit was all about shattering conventions, what musical rules are waiting to be broken today? When you look at the landscape right now, what conventions feel totally tired? What boundaries are just begging to be pushed? That 1977 spirit is absolutely still alive in any artist willing to treat radical content with radical form. I highly encourage you to dive into the source materials we covered today. Go listen to Bowie's Low, explore early post-punk, and for sure track down Grupo newly unearthed 1977 recordings. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep exploring, and I'll catch you next time.